Welcome back to the American Recovery Podcast. Today's episode features Steve Miller. Steve is the project manager for the Mid America Prevention Technology Transfer Center and host of the Prevention Perk podcast. During Steve's 35 years in recovery, he has been a treatment provider, professional fundraiser, prevention specialist, and led a DUI counseling program, and gave a recently released TED-style talk at NatCon 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Miller. Steve Miller, welcome to the American Recovery Podcast.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm glad you invited me.
We appreciate you being here. So, Steve, tell us your recovery story.
Well, I never really know where to begin with that, Daniel. I was born on a Tuesday. I don't know if you want to go that far back or not, but I was born and raised in the mid-'70s, I guess we should say, in a small town in South Central Kansas, actually, is where I was raised. And I don't know. I always tell people that I grew up a very typical young person. I did all the things that you do when you're a kid, or at least at that time. I played all the sports. I was in scouts, those kinds of things. I think, by my own description, I was a pretty popular kid. I had lots of friends, that kind of stuff. But I think that I don't think any of the background as far as where I come from or what I do is as important as for me to understand that I'm an addict, and I'm an addict in recovery. And I need to remember the most important thing is that when I take on board any type of a substance that's mind or mood altering, for some reason, I'm the kind of person that likes to have more. And I didn't know that growing up. I can remember the first time I actually took a sip of a beer, and I thought it was repulsive. My dad let me have a pull off of a Coors, and I was like, that's nasty stuff. And then I can remember a couple of instances when I was maybe in elementary school, and we found a stash of somebody's beer, and I just thought the stuff was repulsive. I really never thought that I would be the kind of person that would drink or smoke. I had seen those cheesy videos when I was in 6th grade about drug use, and I was like, not for me, all of that stuff. And I had friends that started doing those kinds of things probably in 9th or 10th grade. That would be my best recollection. And I would hang out with them, but I really didn't want anything to do with it. It just was not something that resonated with me. The strange thing is one night we were at this gathering at a particular place, and a friend of mine that I'd known since I was in like 3rd grade, he said, "Do you drink?" And I said, I really don't like the taste of it. And he said, I never really used to like to drink either. He said the taste of it was horrible, but I started smoking, and for some reason it makes it better. And I just out of the blue said, "You got a cigarette?" And he handed me a cigarette, and I started smoking a cigarette, and then I started drinking the beer. And I think the secret of all this is that you can't really find out if you've got the ism, so to speak, unless you use the substances. And it tasted okay. I mean, I really never acquired a taste, but it was palatable. And I drank 1, and I drank 2, and I drank 3. And I'm here to tell you, Daniel, after that first couple of beers and smoking the first couple of cigarettes, I really don't remember much of what happened. And then the next morning when I woke up, what I told myself was, that was a lot of fun. I can't wait to do it again. Now, if you ask me what was fun about it, I can't tell you. I just know that I wanted to do it again. And as I look back on it, it was just one of those moments where one thing led to another. And I don't think I really understood anything about boundaries. I didn't understand anything about what I was getting myself into. And I did not understand why I kept getting into a lot of trouble. I know you used to be in law enforcement. I met a lot of law enforcement when I was drinking, and I never really understood why. It didn't make any sense that remember I said, I just can't wait to do that again because that was a lot of fun. I just wanted to have a lot of fun, and it was causing these problems that I couldn't really understand. And it was one thing after another. I got expelled from school for drinking on school property. I had a series of minor in possession, car accidents. I had a DUI that was reduced by some form of grace, I guess, to reckless driving. But those kind of things just kept happening. And at some point, and this was very quickly, at some point, there was just this moment where I was like, I'm all in on this thing. And I can trace it back to It was 9:08 in the morning. It was a Saturday. I was at my friend Chris's house. I had stayed the night there with a couple of other people. His older brother came in. He turned on the cassette deck player and played a song by Leonard Skinner, and it's called That Smell. And something in that moment, I had never heard it before, but it was electrifying. And I remember thinking, that is rock and roll, and that's the lifestyle I want. And it was like a light switch went on, and it was a domino effect. Everything just fell into order after that. I started drinking as often as I could and as much as I could. I started smoking pot. I started taking speed. Within 90 days, I was taking LSD on the weekends. It was just like everything just kind of happened in rapid succession. And as I illustrated earlier, I gave up all the other things that I used to do. I stopped playing sports, and people would say, "Well, how come you're not playing basketball anymore?" And I'm like, I got other things to do. And the other things that I was doing was what I've already illustrated. And I wasn't really cognizant of it. I just know that it was what I did. And I loved it. I thought it was the way I wanted to live. I had long hair. I wanted to be, this rock star image. I don't play guitar or anything. It was just kind of like this delusion, if you will. And I think there's also some research that would suggest that, as adolescents, we're looking for an identity. We want to fit in somewhere. And for some reason, the substitute that I found was this coolness of rock and roll and the people that I was gravitating towards and the things that we were doing, the substances. And they just kept complicating my life. And I really didn't understand it. I thought it was just, I always thought the cops were just messing with me. It was just something I couldn't understand. And I just wanted to be left alone. Well, I'm self-centered. It's like I just want to be self-destructive is really what I want to do. And that continued for my high school career. I mean, the thing I looked forward to was not graduation. I looked forward to the graduation party. And that's kind of how my life went. My friends graduated and went to college. My friends got married. My friends did the normal things that they do. And I wanted to know how late the bar was open. And I just found myself in this cycle of just being drunk. And I would sometimes come home at 2, 3, 4 in the morning and had to work at 6 a.m. And I would say, I'm not going to do it tonight. And by 3 in the afternoon, I'd be like, well, I'd probably go down to the Royal Club and see who's down there and have a beer. And it would just start all over again. And I didn't have any frame of reference for addiction. I thought alcoholism was something that happened to people that were old. I didn't have any idea that it happened to young people. But I do know that I had one point, I was about 18, 19 years old, and I wanted to try to go to college because everybody else was doing something with their life. I was partying, and I would lay off the stuff, and then I'd start again, and then I'd drop out of college. It's not a proud thing. It took me 13 years to finish a 4-year degree. I would start, I'd stop, I'd start, I'd stop, I'd start, I'd stop. And the common denominator is I knew that if I was drinking and smoking and doing that other stuff, I couldn't keep up. And so I would say, I'm not going to do it anymore. But that didn't last very long, 3 weeks, a month, and then I would start all over again. But I didn't put a correlation to it. I think the biggest turning point in my addiction was, I think it was in the summer between my 19th or 20th year, something like that. Some people turned me on to cocaine. And I could never afford that stuff, but that's all I ever thought about. It was insidious. Is the only way I can describe it. I became kind of a hanger-on. I for whatever reason, a group of older guys liked me for some reason, and they would invite me to the parties, and they always had plenty because they sold it, and they just, hey, come on down, man, we're gonna have a party tonight. And it was just like this out of control journey that I didn't really understand. And when I was 23 years old, I was with a group of people, and we were down at the lake in Oklahoma on Memorial Day weekend, I believe it was. We got into a car wreck, and I ended up in the hospital. I wasn't driving, I was a passenger. And that was the first time for an extended period of time that I was off anything. And I was scared because I'd been injured, and I ended up living with a relative for a period of time. I was on crutches. the whole 9 yards. And I started to reevaluate it, like I need to do something with my life. And then after a period of time, some friends of mine said, man, you need to get out. And they came and got me and they took me out. And lo and behold, I started all over again. I went to this festival and I was on crutches and I passed out near the fire and my sleeping bag caught on fire with me in it. I mean, these are the kinds of crazy things that were happening. And it melted the sleeping bag to my pants. I had to cut my pant leg off my shoes to get them off. And I remember just coming out of that stupor going, man, it's awful hot all of a sudden. And, it was a near miss. And those kinds of things were happening. And then it really got crazy because of that accident, I got a pretty large insurance settlement to cover my medical expenses and to cover my pain and suffering or whatever it was. And that money disappeared really quick. But it allowed me to do something that I also had wanted to do but didn't. It allowed me to move away from my small town and get away from those people that were causing me all those problems, namely the police. And I moved to Wichita actually, and started. I was working in radio then, but I went to work for a radio station there locally, and the party continued until all that money ran out. And then I had this bright idea, and I always say, that still small voice spoke to me in the night, and it said, "You need to get married and settle down and grow up." Later, I realized that was just my mother's voice saying, "You need to grow up." But I found a victim, and it was a horrific experience. I thought if I got a permanent, if I got into a relationship and I got married, things would be better. And it just spun out of control so fast. And it was always her fault. I mean, that's the part of being an addict. It's everybody else's responsibility but yours. And it's none of your business what I'm doing. I let you live with me. This kind of nonsense that goes on. And the cops were showing up because of domestic disputes and things like that. And one night I just was with a coworker of mine, and he said, "Let's go to the ball game." And I said, "Hey, that'd be cool." And the ball game started at 7. And at 4 a.m., I was in the wrong place with the wrong person at the wrong time. And something inside of me said, how did this happen? I just went to a ball game, and I had a lot of explaining to do when I got home. And I really didn't even know how to explain it. I just know that I went to a ball game and I came home at 4 a.m. And those two things don't add up if you know how to do math. And it's because I started something that I shouldn't have started. And primarily I started drinking. And I didn't understand that that's where it always started. I always thought maybe I smoked too much pot, I did too much coke, I shouldn't do the LSD, but I never thought about the drinking. And I got as honest with the woman that I was with as I could, and she said, "You need to go see a professional, or I'm off of this crazy train." She said, "You're not normal," and I didn't know what that meant. So I called a place. It was Memorial Day weekend. That's twice I've mentioned Memorial Day weekend. That's really bizarre. It's Memorial Day weekend. And so I had to wait till Tuesday, right? But on Monday, Memorial Day, we went to a party and I sat at this person's house. It was a friend of hers. I didn't even really know them. They ordered a bunch of pizza and there was a bottle of Jack Daniels sitting on the coffee table. And I sat there for 3 solid hours with a glass of Jack Daniels in front of me eating pizza, saying this over and over in my head. Why won't you take the first drink? It's just take a drink. I just looked at it. It was like this war was going on in my head. And somehow or another, I didn't take a drink. I just could not reach out and do it. Tuesday morning, she said, "You need to call someplace." And at that time, there was a facility called Charter Hospital, and they used to play these commercials at the radio station that I worked at. And she said, "Call that place. I don't know what it's about, but she said, call them because they say if you don't get help in someplace, get help. If you don't get help at Charter, please get help somewhere," or something like that. So I called them, and of course she's listening on the phone to make sure that I'm legit. And I have no idea why I said this, Daniel, other than grace. I told them that I was having a tough time with my relationship. It was a struggle with work, all these kind of pity things that were going on in my life. And I think I said this because I wanted her to know that I was going to change. I said, "I used to have a problem with drugs and alcohol, but I don't anymore." Now, that's been like 72 hours. In my mind, I don't have that problem anymore because that was so bad. It's never going to happen again. Right. And they said, come on out and talk to us. Well, long story short, I thought it was a joke. I couldn't believe what they were telling me, that, that it was the drugs and alcohol that were causing all these problems. And they thought that I needed to go to treatment. And they also told me that they wanted like $15,000. And I said, have a nice day. And a couple of days later, for some strange reason, I don't know why, but this guy called me and he said, I kind of understand that part of your issue is you can't afford to come here. And I said, well, I don't even know that I need to go to a treatment program. He said, well, I found a place for people like you. And I got kind of indignant. I was like, what do you mean people like me? He goes, you got 15 grand? And I was like, no. And he goes, it's a place for people like you. And he sent me to this facility and I went, and to me, it was a joke. I couldn't even believe that I was doing it because I wanted to be in her good graces. That's the bottom line. I took this evaluation. It's called 21 questions. I don't think that's the official term, but if you take these, it's a battery of questions about your substance use. And if you, and I remember when I got done, I was being very sarcastic, and I said to the woman that administered, I said, well, did I pass or fail? And she said, well, it's not really pass or fail. It's if you answer yes to 3 or more, you probably have a substance issue that you need to look at. And I was fairly confident that I didn't answer yes to any of them. She said, you answered yes to 11 and you probably lied on the other 10. And I was like, that don't make no sense, And I don't have any idea other than I think I was trying to save the relationship. And they talked to me and I said, I need to think about this. And for some reason, I checked myself into the treatment, almost like automatic. And the first 3 weeks that I was there, it was a joke. I can't believe that they kept me there. I made fun of the process. We would go into these group rooms and people would have their feelings, experiences, and I would mock them. And I would look at my watch and flick my lighter as to annoy people, like, it's time to take a break, don't you think? So I could go outside and smoke. I really was not engaged in the process. And 3 weeks into it, and this is the turning point, I was in my room and I decided I need to figure out a way to make it the owner's fault that I was there because I wanted my down payment back. The selfishness of addiction, because I knew that I could buy some things with that money. And I was in my room and I can remember thinking to myself, I don't really know how to say this to him, but I don't want to be here. I want my money back. And that sounded, it needed to be more convincing. And I had been to 3 different 12-step meetings at that point, and they all talked about having a relationship with a power greater than yourself. And in that moment, I thought, I've never really prayed before in my life. I have no frame of reference for even how you do that. But I thought, maybe I should try it. And so I did the most gooberistic thing that I thought of, and I kneeled down beside the bed, and then I got afraid. And I got up, and I opened the door and looked in the hallway to make sure that there was nobody out there, because I didn't want to get caught, right? Too humiliating. And I went back and kneeled down beside the bed. And then this thought entered my mind. I think I looked to the right, but I don't think I looked to the left. I wished I had this on video. And so I looked left, I looked right. There's nobody in the hallway. I kneeled down and I said, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you're there. I don't know that you're listening. And I don't know if you can help me. But if you can help me figure out a way to get out of this dilemma that I'm in, probably didn't say it that nicely. I said, I'd appreciate the support. And I got up and I sat down on the edge of the bed. I don't know what I was expecting. Different 12-step programs have volumes, different literatures that they rely on to work their program. And my roommate had been at this particular facility 7 times, and I had formulated this belief system that it's a money-making racket that's only making the owner rich and the county government wealthy. Everybody's getting something out of this, but nobody's getting any help. And I made sure they knew that on a regular basis. But I looked over there, and he had one of those books on his nightstand, and I just reached over and started reading it, like almost on autopilot. And there was something in there that I read that, for the first time, it's funny how the black and white on the page will actually get to you if you actually think about it. It's like I just faked my way. And I read what it said, and in a sense, it said that it wasn't about how often you drank, or what kind of substances you used, or who you used with, or when you used, or where you used. The bottom line is what happens to you when you start to use. And I was like, that's what they're talking about here. I had no idea. It was like I was the last person to figure out that it was happening because I couldn't stop doing these things that I said I was going to stop doing. And I went down the hall, and as I was going to talk to the owner, the one that I wanted my money back from, he opened his door and said, "Hey, Steve," he said, "I was just coming down to talk to you." He said, "I've been thinking about you." And I was like, "Well, I was just coming to talk to you." Long story short, I ended up not doing a 30-day stay in this treatment center. He was gracious enough to extend my stay there for no extra cost because he knew how much I was struggling and how much extra help I needed. I would guess I was a special case. And had I not stayed, I probably would not have continued. But I started taking things seriously. I started adding to the group. I started talking to the people. I stopped mocking them and making fun of things because I was scared to death, is the bottom line. That was my defense. And that started to change. And so then I was really close to the treatment center, and they had an aftercare program, and I would go to that on Wednesday nights. But I didn't want to go to any of those 12-step programs because those were filled with old people. I was 25 years old at the time, and I was like, I don't want to hang out with those old people. And one day I got off work, and I was walking to my car, and I just heard this voice that said, "If you don't start going to those meetings, you're not going to last." And I thought, and I opened my glove box. There was like this little booklet they gave you for meetings in the area, and there happened to be one in 30 minutes. And I drove down there, and I drove past this little house in the inner city, and I looked at the front door, and I said, "I don't like anybody in there, and nobody in there is going to like me," and I drove away. And I got about a block away, and I said, "You're an idiot. Go back." Well, Daniel, I went around the block 6 times. And finally, I said, "You're an idiot. Either go in or go home." And so I finally walked in the front door, and the very first thing I had, this guy said, "Hi, my name's Al, and I give everyone a hug who comes to our meeting." And I was like, "Oh, I picked the wrong day to not sniff glue." I was like, "What is happening here?" And I sat right by the seat by the door. And they started the meeting, and they said, "Well, Steve, you're new here. How about if you start the conversation first?" And I was like, I can't believe this is happening. And I told them how much I thought this was ridiculous and that I didn't want to be here. And then this guy wants to hug me, and I don't really like you people. And they all started laughing at me. And for just a brief second, I wanted to like take my toys and go home, like you guys. And I didn't. I realized that they weren't laughing at me. They were laughing with me. They understood how I was feeling in that moment. Now, when I had left treatment, they said I needed 2 things. I needed a sponsor and I needed a home group. And I said, "What's a home group?" And they said, "You'll know it when you find it." Now, I always say it's kind of like the old TV show Cheers, where everybody knows your name. And in that moment, I was like, well, this place should be my home group. Now, here's a person that, 40 minutes before that didn't want anything to do with it. And now all of a sudden, I'm going to come here all the time. Now, that's addict thinking in a nutshell right there. 0 to 60 with no explanation. I'm just going to do it because it feels right. The other part, they said get a sponsor. And my retort to that was, well, how much is that going to cost me? Because it was a money-making racket. And so I started going to these meetings, and I started meeting people, and I started being what they call of service. And I had a couple of sponsors, and one called me and said, "I'm not going to meetings anymore, so find a different one." And then another guy, it just fell apart. And one day I was, this is always it's not the hardest story to tell. It's the most humbling story to tell because I was not looking for anything that particular day. And I remember I still smoked at the time. And I had stayed and helped to clean up, and I went back to get my pack of cigarettes, and I picked them up, and I heard this voice that said, "Hi, my name's Clarence." He said, "I think you and I have a lot in common. I think you should start calling me." And I turned around, and the first thing I noticed was an African-American bull rider in a cowboy hat. I didn't know he was a bull rider at the time, but I found out later that he was. And I took one step back, and I said, "What in the world could you and I possibly have in common?" And that comment was based strictly on the color of his skin. And I, to this day, don't really like telling that story because it shows how ignorant I was, how misguided I was, how much of a image I tried to portray. And this gentleman, Clarence, I will safely say that had I and he not continued to befriend one another, I probably wouldn't be having this conversation with you today. And he knew that I was coming across as very racist. I mean, he knew very clearly that I thought I was better than him, and he didn't let that bother him. He just kept asking questions, and I said, "Why would I call you?" He said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "I live out on the west side." "Why?" And he said, "That's perfect." And I said, "Why does that have anything to do with calling you?" And he said, "Well, weather patterns move from west to east, and if you call me first thing in the morning, I'll know to put the window down and it won't rain on my new linoleum." And I said, "That's the craziest damn thing I've ever heard." And I started calling him. It's almost like I was on autopilot. And they say in recovery circles that you come around here long enough, we'll love you till you learn to love yourself. And Clarence was someone that was a demonstration that he loved me until I learned to start taking care of me. And he showed up every day, and he held me accountable, and he never asked me to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. And he explained to me what it was that I was dealing with. And I think that that's the primary reason that I'm here today, is because I was able to actually build a bond with someone that I wouldn't have crossed the street to say hello to. That's just where my mindset was at that time. And as I got further into recovery, I mean, I knew his whole family. He's passed several years ago. His sister died about a year ago, and I stayed in touch with the family even after he had passed away. And I remember at one time I called to talk to him, and he had a stroke and lived with his mother. And his mother answered the phone, and she said, "Well, Mr. Steve, it's been several days since I've heard your voice on the other end of the line." I said, "Well, I've been kind of busy, Costello." And she said, "See to it that doesn't happen again." She said, "Whatever it is that happens between you and Sonny is really very good for both of you." And she said, "I don't want to see you miss out on that." I said, "Yes, ma'am." And then sometime later, I said, you're almost like having a second or a third grandmother." I said, you're just the sweetest little old lady." And they just welcomed me into their family. And when Costella died, I went to her funeral, and I'll never forget this. I remember the sign on the wall said, "Seating capacity, 235 people." And I didn't count them specifically, but I looked across the room, and there were 234 persons of color and me. And there was only one seat on the back row. And I sat down, and I was uberly uncomfortable. And then it dawned on me, this is probably how a lot of minorities feel on any given day. And I sat there through the service, and I wanted to leave when it was over. And then I thought, you should do the right thing and go down front and pay your last respects. And I stood in line, and there were people looking at me like who's Waldo? And how'd he get here?
Why is he so easy to spot?
Yeah, some little old lady came up to me, and she goes, "So, how did you know Costella?" And I said, "I'm a friend of Sonny's." And then she said, "He's a friend of Sonny's." And they started talking to one another, and everything went back to normal. And I stood in line, and I could see Clarence, and he saw me out of the corner of his eye, and he'd been, "Thank you for coming." You know how you do all of that when you're there. He caught a glimpse of me out of the corner of his eye, and he just started to sob, because he knew how much it was for me to be there. Like for me to actually face this and to be a part of this and to do this for him, his mother, his family, given the situation and given my mindset. And that's just a really simple illustration of how a simple program can help change your life. And I can tell you other stories that I faced along the way that addressed things like that. Not just how I looked at minorities, how I looked at women, how I thought about them. Those kinds of things seem to start working themselves out the longer I stayed in recovery. And I was able to actually start to develop what I considered to be true friendships and true relationships. The relationship I went into recovery to save, or that I went into treatment to save, did not last. After about 3 months, she said, she had just turned 21. And she said, "I don't want a sober life. That's going to have to be for you." And she left. And I realized in that moment that I was either going to have to do it for myself or it wasn't going to get done. And I made the right choice. And it's interesting. I still talk to her from time to time. Every 5 to 7 years, for some reason or another, we'll cross paths or something. And I spoke to her just recently, and I told her about my sobriety, and she said, "I've always been really proud of you that you made the choice to stay there." And she knew I made the choice because it wasn't a choice between her and recovery. It was a choice between the substances and recovery.
Mm.
And I had to be very clear about that. Her didn't have anything to do with it. And so I stayed in recovery and have been ever since. I started doing things that I never thought I would ever do. I was involved with this alumni association at the treatment center that I got clean at, and we started doing these fundraisers, and then we would give the money to clients that would come that didn't have clothes on their back or needed a toothbrush. We did a Christmas thing one year. It was the most, for me, trying to be a tough guy, and I'm not. Never have been, but in my head I was. We did this Santa thing where we sponsored a family. And I can remember we raised a lot of money, and they asked me to start being the DJ. Now, I worked in radio, but I'd never DJ'd live events, and so I started DJing these live events, and we would take money at the door, and we would give it back to the treatment center in some way or another. And we bought all these gifts for this family and everything. And I remember this little girl. You could tell she knew that they weren't going to have Christmas. Mom and Dad had said they're not having Christmas. They can't afford it. Whatever. And this was in the basement of this facility, and there was an exit because it's a basement. And Santa came through that door, and I'll never forget the look on that 6-year-old girl's face. First, it was horrified because Santa's here and real. And then she realized Santa's here, and that means Christmas. And it was just like her eyes told that story. And it was like, I remember thinking in that moment, this is worth being clean and sober. I'd never really experienced that kind of impact and seen that in such a naive way. And it was just little things like that really kept me coming back, I mean, I got involved and did all the things that you do in early recovery. I went to lots of meetings. I went to conferences. I had a sponsor. I sponsored people. And at 3 years of recovery, the phone rang, and I was working as a radio announcer. And the voice on the other end of the phone said, "We're looking for a new counselor at the treatment center, and your name's on the list. Would you be interested?" And I was like, "Well, that's not what I do for a living. I'm a DJ." And she goes, "Well, yeah, that would mean changing your career, but the owner would like to talk to you." And I was like, "Okay." So I went down and had a conversation with him, and I said, "I have no idea why you're asking me to do this." I said, "I don't have any education or anything." He said, "I thought about that myself." He said, "I interviewed 2 people today that have a master's degree and one that has a PhD. And I realized something when I was having this conversation. They can be counselors, but they don't understand what it means to be an addict or an alcoholic.
Mm.
You know what it means to be an addict and an alcoholic, and I can teach you to be a counselor." And that made sense. And I said, "Okay." And I changed my career, and I went to work as a substance in a treatment program. And then I started running the DUI program. It was for the county, and it was twice monthly. It was a full day DUI school. And I started doing that. And at the same time, I finally got my act together, and I went back to school. I actually got a college degree. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But I did this DUI program. And when I would do this DUI program, I would notice that the recidivism rate was insane. Like the number of first-time offenders that repeat is incredible. I don't think listeners and the general public really understands the significance of drunk driving. I mean, Daniel, I've been in 16 car wrecks, all of them under the influence. 9 of them I was driving, 7 of them someone else was. And I was hospitalized because of a motorcycle accident. And I was under the influence of multiple substances. And so I understood the damage that it can cause, but I didn't really understand the prevalence of it. And I used to think there's got to be something besides, the DUI school and what happens before the red lights go on. I had no idea about prevention. I'd never really, I knew of it, but I thought that's what they did in elementary and middle school, I didn't know about it as a career. And so I taught the DUI program. I did that for like 7 years. And then I went to school for something completely different, and I got into professional fundraising and did that for a number of years. But I still did the DUI class, and then I moved away from Kansas and was hired for a professional fundraising opportunity that after a period of time didn't work out, and I was kind of like in a foreign land, so to speak. I moved to this position, and it didn't promise out the way that it was planned, or planned out the way it was promised. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. And one day, I remember I'd seen this job thing on Indeed.com, and it was talking about a prevention specialist. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I've done public speaking, and I understand something about substances and that kind of stuff. So I applied for it. Long story short, when I'd moved to Springfield, where I live now, I'd gotten a postcard about teenage underage drinking prevention. And I thought that'd be a cool place to work. Fast forward 3 years. One day I got hired for this job, and I'm in this closet looking at the different brochures that they have, and lo and behold, there's that brochure. The same one that was sent to my inbox or my mailbox 3 years earlier. And I was like, wow, that is really serendipitous. It's like I said I'd always like to work here, and here I am working. And so that's where, at some point, this whole experience I've had, because I'm in recovery for a number of years then, I've ran this DUI program, and I'm frustrated that, that there was nothing that I knew of before that. And I didn't really understand it. And I didn't really want to continue being a counselor. That was not, at that time, that was not something that really seemed to interest me. I liked the DUI program. Then when I got into the prevention aspect, I was like, oh, there's a whole continuum here. And then I learned about the continuum care. There's a whole science that I didn't know about. And I remember when I got hired to do this role as a prevention specialist, I remember telling Chris, I said, I probably don't know about this job, but I'll give you at least 3 years. That was 15 years ago. So there's something in it that fits right for me. And part of that is that after I got into working in prevention, I started thinking about my history. And I started thinking about how music had been a part of the decisions I made and the lifestyle that I thought I was living. And I used the music as a justification, kind of as a self-destructive mechanism. It'd be like, rock and roll and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, basically, and heavy emphasis on the drinking and the drugs, because I thought that that's what you did, and a song would just fuel that. Leonard Skinner, they're not to blame, because the actual truth about That Smell is not a dope smoking anthem that I grew up believing that it was, and many of my friends. It was actually written by Ronnie Van Zant because one of his band members was completely spun out, and he wouldn't listen. And he said, well, I'll write this song, and if the knucklehead has to play it on stage every night, maybe he'll get the message. It's actually a pro-life song. And I started thinking about that. I started thinking about other songs, and I started realizing that it was me that put the meaning to it. It was me that misunderstood what was being said. It was me that used it for my own glorification or justification, And I was like, I wonder if there's any research out there. And I started talking to my boss, and at first he was very like, I don't know that that's really prevention. So I started looking into research and found out there was a lot of research that supported the fact that there is a bond during our adolescent experience with music, and how music actually influences the onset of alcohol use and the quantity of alcohol consumed. They've done studies with high school students, college students, even young adults, and the correlation between the music they consume and the way they consume substances. And the more music you consume and the more video music that you watch, the higher your consumption rates are. They look at music, and they look at music, and it's the imagery. I pulled out certain videos and have demonstrated like the way they're dressed, or the portrayal of the song or the interpretation of the music. And it's like, woo, I'm pumped up and I'm ready for the party. And they did a study with a bunch of college students before they went out, to the bars, and that control groups, those that listened to music, those that listened to videos, and those that didn't. And the ones that listened to videos far and above consumed more alcohol than those that didn't listen to music at all. And so I started putting together a presentation, and I started talking about how I thought, based upon the research and my own experience and how music had impacted me. And the turning point, because that was what kind of led me, not, I can't blame the music, but it was an excuse. But when I was in that treatment program, there was a guy named Father Leo Booth. He's a Catholic priest, and he did a video, and it's called Spirituality and Recovery. And I remember watching that video, and he made this comment about a young man that had been in one of the treatment programs he worked for. And the guy came up to him and he said, "Do you think the songs the lyrics of a popular song could have been the reason why I came to treatment?" And Father Leo said, "Well, if God can speak to Isaiah in the Old Testament, why couldn't he speak to you through the lyrics of a song?" And I remember thinking in that moment, wow, I wonder if something like that would work for me. Now, that's interesting to have a thought that says, I wonder if something like that would work for me, when it just worked for me, because it got my attention. And I started listening to music in a different way. I started listening to what I thought the music meant in a holistic or in a healthy way, not in a destructive way. What does this mean when they sing these lyrics? What does it mean about this song? And I started at some point, I think when I had been in recovery about 7 years, I started actually doing a daily journal. I would pick a song and I would write about it. And I've literally written about hundreds of songs about what I think they mean, how they could be beneficial in my life, how they might be beneficial to other people. And I call it following the muse, because a lot of days I'll wake up and that song will be playing in my head. As a matter of fact, I did it this morning. A song was playing in my head, and I just sat down and I just write about it for 15 or 20 minutes. And I've collected hundreds of these songs. So I'd been doing this, and then I started researching this, and then I put together this presentation, and then I started delivering it, and people started telling me, this is really a unique idea. And so I started talking about it more and more, and started to kind of think, I need to take this to another level. This really just kind of talks about the correlation between music and substance use. But what does it really have to do with people in general, and what does it have to do with what I've been doing? Is there really some way to demonstrate how music's been beneficial in my life? And so since November of this past year, so 2023, I've done a series of presentations on how music impacts the generations in the workplace, how music impacts communication styles, how music impacts our choices around substances. And then I was very lucky to have been invited to do a TED-style talk for the National Conference on Mental Health and Well-Being. And I talked about some of the things I'm sharing with you about how music impacted my life. And it's been a fascinating journey, because there is so much research out there now about music and the correlation to mental health, mental well-being, communication, substance use, and I just put my own spin on it. I talk about it from the standpoint of substance recovery, because it is kind of a cornerstone. And I look back on it and I think, I couldn't have made this up, because I can remember being a kid, and you and I talked about this before we got started. The songs we heard when we were little, they're hugely influential in our lives. I don't listen to these songs, but I can tell you, because my parents played these songs on the hi-fi stereo, and my job was to go and take the stack of 6 albums and turn them over, and then they would play through on the stereo. And I would hear things by Charlie Rich, and I would think, if I'd have known what that song was about when I was 7 years old, because it's about, it's an intimate portrayal, and I joked with my dad recently. I said, "Oh, that's how I knew that you were being frisky with Mom," and my mom just started laughing, because I know those lyrics: "Joy to the World," "Bad Bad Leroy Brown," Helen Reddy's "I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar," the Charlie Rich song, "When We Get Behind Closed Doors." And those songs are ingrained in my brain. And what I realized is the song that really kind of got inside of me the first time is called Bad Bad Leroy Brown by Jim Croce. And I remember it just kind of wow. And what I've collected from that is I really love story songs. I like all kinds of music. If you saw my music collection, you'd be like, yeah, he's not kidding. I've got a very eclectic collection of music. But I love a song that is a very vivid story, like Bad Bad Leroy Brown. And so those are the kinds of things that I have listened to across my life. And I have hundreds of favorite story songs, if you will. And so that's kind of what I've based this on, is the fact that music is a part of our lives from very early on, and it plays a significant role in our lives. According to some researchers, it helps us define our personality, because when we're adolescents, we're going through all of this angst and all of this, I don't know who I am. And what's interesting about it is, for me, music could have been one of those things that maybe helped me sort it out if I'd have listened to the music. But what I ended up doing was, instead of sorting it out and letting some of the music help me understand some of the emotions and some of the conflict that all adolescents go through, I was allowing substances to resolve that for me. And then I would use the music as a catalyst for drinking more. And then I would drink more. And it became that relationship, as opposed to letting the music just be what it is for the adolescent experience. And that's kind of what I'm trying to draw upon now, in a healthy way, because music is highly influential. And if it's misunderstood, it can be a huge trigger in a person's life. That's kind of where I come from now. And it's all a work in progress, because there's more research that comes out. There's a deeper understanding that I have about it. And it's when I get an opportunity to do the TED Talk, because it really kind of talks about this experience, having a chance to talk with you and others on a podcast about it. And it's leading me in a direction where I would really like to write, I don't know that I would call it a memoir, but I would like to be able to capture this story and what I'm learning about music, and kind of tell that in a way that illustrates my life, but also could also be beneficial to the reader. Like, they might be able to see some of the tools or techniques and things that I've done over the years that have been helpful or beneficial to me in understanding how music's impacted my life and the choices that I've made, both before, during, and since I've been recovering. And that's the fascinating part about it. And it just, to me, it seems too serendipitous. I couldn't have planned it. It makes a lot of sense. People keep telling me to keep doing it because they think it's fun to listen to. And my next step is to not just make it fun and entertaining to listen to. I really want it to have some depth, or something that people can really take away, something that they can use in their lives. And so that's kind of what I'm exploring now. And I'm talking with a number of people that do curriculum development and that kind of stuff to help me figure out how to really present it in a way that people can go, I could see how I could do this in my life. Because I've since talked to a lot of people that music is a huge influence in their lives, good and bad. And that's what's fascinating, is I've met people that music has impacted their life in a way like I've described, detrimentally. I've talked to people that had phenomenal experiences with it, and their lives went on to be very prosperous. And I've talked to people that have made, like, prosperous, like financially rewarding, because of a song. And I'm like, you mean one song caused you to do this? And they're like, yeah. And there's been others since, but it was that one song that opened the door, if you will, and they started to explore this other part of their life. And I'm intrigued by that, because I think that music is a very powerful force in our lives, because I've lived through it. I just want to demonstrate it and be able to be comprehensive enough for people to say that this is legitimate. It's not just Steve's gooberistic life. It's actually, there's some research that supports what I'm talking about. I have no idea if that actually answers your question about telling me about your recovery journey, because there's plenty of what we would call war stories that I can tell you, and I don't really try to glorify any of what my using was like, because for me, the older I get and the less rough around the edges I become, the less, there's nothing that was fun about it. I mean, sure, there were times when I had fun with my friends, but the destruction of it and the harm that I caused myself, my family, various friends, relationships, you can't say anything about that was fun. There's no way to slice that. They might be funny depending on who they're presented to, because in some circles we identify that we did these things, and we're pretty much grateful that we survived them. I've already said the car wrecks I've been in and that kind of stuff. And I'm by the grace, I'm lucky I didn't end up incarcerated, because it wasn't that I didn't qualify for it. Part of it was maybe I grew up in a small town and they just let your parents deal with it or not deal with it. They just said, oh, that's part of, kids do that. We'll take it away from them. There were times when there were narcotics involved and they were just confiscated. And I could have gone to jail. And for whatever reason, I didn't. And so, yeah, I look back on it less and less with anything that really I find not that it's not of value, but it doesn't really mean anything except to me as a signpost to don't ever go back that way, because it promises the same thing that it always did. I have a hard time believing that after running a DUI program for 7 years, the first thing I wouldn't get if I started drinking again would be a DUI. And it's like, how clear does the writing have to be on the wall to say probably had not to do that?
Yeah. Last time, how long have you been in sustained recovery now?
Actually, it's interesting because my sobriety date is Memorial Day, and this Memorial Day was 35 years.
35 years, fascinating.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, I came into recovery. That'll tell my age, which is I have a harder time with that. I was 25 years old when I first started going to 12-step meetings, and I've gone, and I share that with people. I've gone to a lot of 12-step programs. Now, I know a lot of people that go to a specific 12-step program, and this is not compare and contrast right or wrong. I just seem to be raised up, if you will, by various people that said different things, get to know different people, understand different aspects of your life. And I've attended and attend various 12-step programs. Now, I have a core group of people that I associate with, but I've given myself permission to do that. And I find that it's really made all the difference because it's a long period of time, and I could have never imagined that I would be having this conversation. I remember telling people, if I die tonight, make sure you bury me with a 12-pack because I'm not sure they sell beer in heaven. I mean, that's kind of a smart-ass thing to say, but that's how, I couldn't imagine life without it. And that's apparently I couldn't imagine death without it, and it's so, yeah, it's been 35 years, and there's been a lot of people and a lot of programs and a lot of help along the way. There is no way that I can take credit for this. I did the footwork, but there are a lot of people, and there is what I call a higher presence, the muse that guides me. And I think that that's what makes all the difference.
Wow, that's awesome. Reflecting on your early days when you were encountering law enforcement regularly, do you think they were making the right decision in the way they handled it? Or do you look back and go, some swift equipment may have been helpful for me? Because there's a lot of discussion around either the legality or the way it should be handled through the justice system. And so I hear stories like yours, and some people, and it's like, they didn't do a thing for me. And others say, I could have gotten a slap on the wrist and they threw the book at me. Yeah. And I've heard a variety of people talk about their experience and their encounters with the justice system and how it did or did not benefit them. What do you think would have been different, and do you think it would have been beneficial had those officers acted differently when they kind of caught you in the middle of it?
It's hard to say, and I understand what you're saying because, for me, they're minor infractions. I've been taken in and I've been had charges and that kind of stuff, but I never had to serve any time. And I think that especially in my hometown, and when it happened with regularity, because they knew who I was. I mean, it's really an uncomfortable position to be known as the radio announcer, and then on the front page, not the front page, they call it the Daily Records, the back page of the paper. And then I remember one time I totaled my mother's car, and this cop was giving me a DUI, and I remember I had to call the police station the next day to get the rap sheet, and the cop said, "You gonna tell everybody what you did last night?" And I'm like, "That's not news." I didn't report it, but the other announcers did. And I think that kind of stuff, all it did was fuel to make me resentful. Now, it might have changed if I'd have had some solitary time, locked up. I might have thought, this really sucks. But it really, at that time, and then the time when the narcotics were involved, and there were 4 of us, we could have all done some serious time. I just felt like it was cocky, so I don't know. It's a really interesting thing that you say, because I did the DUI program, and there's a lot of bitterness about the cops and the misunderstanding of the judicial system and why they arrest people. And I understand that because I thought it was just a game or a money making racket. So
Mhm.
I don't know if it had got my attention. There were times when they let my parents talk to me about it and they weren't successful because I kept doing it. And then there was the time when this officer, I did some serious damage with an automobile, and he said, "I'm going to cite you for DUI." And I went from having a good time, and I, I was extremely intoxicated. I told him exactly what I'd been doing, and then when he said, "I'm going to arrest you," I flipped on a dime, and I got indignant and angry, and wanted to go to blows because he didn't understand who he was messing with. I'm this important person. No. So I don't know. I mean, maybe if they'd have hauled me in and made it stick, it might have helped. But when I moved away from my hometown, just for a period of time, the cops stopped showing up, and then one day it started all over again. And I didn't know any. I thought it was because they knew me in this small town. Then I moved to a city of 500,000 people, and nobody knows me. And the next thing you know, the cops are knocking on the door, or they're knocking on the window, um, the car, and that kind of stuff. And it's just like, so I don't know. I don't know if that would work. Scared Straight was really popular when I was younger, and I don't know if that would have scared me straight or not. I know I'm not cut out for long term. Nobody is, I don't think, but I'm not cut out for it. But would it have worked? Would it have been a deterrent? I don't know. I think that what's interesting is it's little things that, even though I never really focused on them, I knew that the things that were happening, they were humiliating. They were shameful. To have your name read on the radio and on the back page of the paper for the things that I was being arrested for was really was humiliating. But I couldn't figure out how to stop doing it. I didn't understand. Stop doing it. It's not complicated. But there was a gentleman who my mother worked for the school district, and this guy he did their prevention stuff at the school, and he had those goofy little they were cartoonish pamphlets and stuff that I thought were ridiculous. But he came to the radio station, and I sometimes think it was an intervention. I don't know for sure. I've never asked for clarification, but he wanted to do a program on substance misuse. And so he did this program, and one day when he was done, we were done recording, he said, "Can I talk to you personally?" And I said, "Sure." And he started talking to me about my drinking and substance use. And I had all the right answers for him. I mocked it. I made fun of it. And he figured out really quick that it was more than just substance misuse, that I was in pretty deep. But you know what? The strange thing is that really stuck with me. It wasn't because he was accusing me. Nobody was shame on you, or we're going to throw you in jail and throw away the key, anything like that. He just showed a genuine concern. And my experience in recovery is that if you can reach somebody one-on-one, just talk to them about where they're at and how they feel in a general way, what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now, you can have more impact in a person's life. Now, surely some of those times that the law comes down on people, or an accident, or the death of a family member, all of those things have significance in people's lives and impact. What I've seen work most consistently is when people come into a program and say, "I'm lost, I'm scared, I'm lonely, I can't stop doing this, and I don't know what to do." And you just sit down and say, "Me too." And you talk about it. And it's in that leveling of the pride about this issue that has the best impact. That's not to say that sometimes recovery won't get people into those centers, and sometimes it won't get them into those rooms, and then people can have that conversation. But very seldom do I see it be "Oh, I'm done." I've seen it happen, but very seldom. That's a long-winded story of saying, I don't really know how to answer that for you, Daniel.
That's okay. It's one of the themes that I'm hoping to address throughout the life of this podcast
Yeah.
is trying to find out where the balance is, because there are some people who are off all the way one way and other way, other
Yeah.
people on the other side.
Stiffer penalties and everything. Yeah.
Either
I mean,
penalties versus none whatsoever. And that the crazy thing is, like, being in the world of prevention for over 3 years and meeting all these people who are in recovery, I met people who both said that getting arrested uh, was never going to stop them. And I've also met people who said, if that cop didn't arrest me that day and put me in jail
Yeah.
with this
Yeah.
person who I met,
Yeah.
I'd probably be dead. Like I've heard both. And so I think the simple answer is there is no simple
Yeah.
answer. And
Yeah.
people don't want to hear that. They
Yeah.
want there to be this, it's
Yeah.
illegal, it's bad, and so we don't do it. Or it's legal, we shouldn't bother with it. They'll find recovery when they
Yeah.
find recovery.
Yeah.
And the worst part about most of these social issues that we're encountering is the answer is not on an extreme. It's somewhere in the middle, to which side is where the argument should be, as opposed to
Yeah.
this absolute
Yeah.
one way or the other. That's the way I perceive it. I kind of look at recovery as if it's built within the system that is the board game Chutes and Ladders. So I'm not
Yeah.
opposed to the chutes, but I'm a big fan of really big ladders. And so a lot of people don't recognize how big a barrier can be when they've never experienced that barrier, because the environment didn't exist for that barrier to stop them from where they were trying to go. And so
Yeah.
some people see it as a barrier to recovery, and other people just go, I didn't even think people would encounter that. I'm trying to work on a, a template for like a tool that helps people understand that. The rough terminology I'm using for it is I'm calling it the recovery roadmap. And it's just a series of, I would take this positive step. This is in the way. I would like, this is a thing that I could do, but because of circumstances, because of whether it be my choices, the system, the environment that I'm in, all those factors, it redirects people and makes
Yeah.
their journey to recovery take significantly longer. And so it's not so much about saying, I have the answers. It's about saying, if we can identify the barriers, we can have nuanced conversations about to what extent those barriers are helpful or necessary versus harmful and otherwise detrimental to people getting into recovery. And so that's why I say I'm a fan of big ladders.
Yeah.
I firmly believe if without a community or a society of consequences, the negative results of that can be pretty extreme.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, all stick no carrot mentality that exists on the other side doesn't ultimately lead to consistency in helping people. Like there are some people who need that hard-headed approach where it's like you're going to do time and that's the only way you're going to sit still long enough. Other people say I did more drugs in prison than I ever did on the street, because it's we like to think it's this place that nothing gets in and nothing gets out, and it's not. The gang life, the gang mentality exists very much behind bars. Substance use is absolutely very prevalent in correctional facilities and prisons. So it doesn't solve the problems, and the idea of using it as a rehabilitation method is, I think, largely a misconception of what it does. It's just keeping people in a place. And that sounds overly simplistic. But if we look at it as saying, are we redirecting them towards something, or are we just pushing pause on their life and saying, you're going to come out
Right.
feeling the exact same things, but potentially with all these other side effects years later? And I think we've blurred the lines between what is helpful and what is necessary. And we want to think that this punishment has to be this, but I don't see a lot of consistency in they did, like, especially like possession crimes. That's a perfect opportunity. And people talk about it to an extreme on one side versus the other. People think that there's a whole lot of incarcerated individuals on simple possession. And I was talking with somebody who could see all the data with the state of Kansas, and there are no people on felony possession charges in the prison. But it was something that was regularly referred to as this giant societal issue. It's like, okay, possession is not getting people life in prison. Usually it's that plus, and it because they don't make that distinction. It's like they have a political aim one way, and the other people who are opposed to that have a kind of a different approach to it. And because we are so entrenched in society and our views, left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, you know, abstinence versus moderation, legal versus illegal, all these things, we just end up finding ourselves in a camp, and the discussion doesn't prove to be very fruitful for most people. They just stick with
Right.
what they have, and they're not actually looking for solutions. And so that's what I found was so fascinating coming from law enforcement to prevention is there's science that explains and provides context for people's experience. And there are some situations like with your story, nothing about it screamed, I had all these horrible things happening to me, and then I looked for a coping mechanism. And so not everybody has that. And so it's good to have the variety for people to understand that it's not just a simple response to horrible things happening to you. That is absolutely a lot of people's stories. And I want to get into those stories and help people find relatability there so they can know, okay, this person went through it as well and got into recovery. And I want to follow in those footsteps, or I know it's possible. I think that's the part that a lot of people lose track of because addiction is isolating in its nature. Even when you're in very social situations, it has a tendency to isolate people to an extreme where even when they're out amongst friends, they're going, I have never been surrounded by more people and felt more alone. And that's what I'm hoping to address with this podcast is where can we have a nuanced conversation? Where can we provide context and where can we look at the science that allows us to provide things like positive childhood experiences? We get off so much into the trauma and abuse elements that exist in society that we regularly downplay what those positive childhood experiences can do. Things like community, having a tight knit community, and or being part of a church family, things that used to just be a part of society, and over time have either fallen apart or just society changed and kind of turned away from a lot of those things. And we take for granted the value of those because we look at them as something from the past. And it's not something that can't be replicated or can't be done again. It's just something that takes a lot of intentionality with a lot of people in a specific area. And so, in and of itself, has to be a community level grassroots effort because if it's not starting in your community, you can't build those systems, whether it's community centers and public events where people can come out and providing opportunities for sober activities for young people or keeping kids busy in the summertime when
But when you were saying that, one of the things that in vernacular, in recovery is everyone hits a bottom, and bottoms are different for everybody. I heard this the other day. It was a story. I think it's Betty Ford. She started a nationwide known treatment program. She said, I never, it did on the outside, it didn't show, it's very sophisticated, very high level. Now that's her story. I didn't live with her or anything, but everybody's bottom's different. Then you have those that go to horrific depths, prisons or, and because of some of the crimes that they commit, and there's those bottoms. I think that what's interesting is that bottom can happen at any moment. It's how do you either raise the person up, or lower the bottom down so that they hit that sweet spot. And treatment is designed to do that. That treatment or going into a 12-step program, it's all designed to have you see that moment where you go, oh, wow, I see. It's like, you mean it's all the drinking and the drugs that's causing this in my life? Yeah, Steve. That's why we have you in a treatment program, but I think that, treatment's designed to do that. And recovery programs are designed to do that. I think what's interesting is it's slowly becoming a little less stigmatized. Mental health first aid is a good example. I've trained all three modules of that: teen, youth, and adult mental health first aid, and several of the components that go with it. And every time I'm in a room with people and I talk about it, I try to illustrate the fact that it's really about the stigma and the inability to talk about these things. Whether you're going through it or not, or somebody that's struggling with it, because we don't seem to want to talk about our dad's drinking or our aunt's cocaine use, or we don't want to talk about mental health issues. They're depressed, they're schizophrenic, whatever it is. It's almost like it's taboo, and that's the stigma around it. And I see slowly that we have this momentum that's saying it's okay to talk about these things, i.e., I'm talking about it with you on a podcast and other people do that. It's not that I'm special or significant. It's just that it's an opportunity to share because it's the people that are outside of the lane that I've been in or outside of the lane of the other people that you're going to talk to. They don't understand it. So there's no one talking about it. And even if they're not directly involved in it, then they shame them or judge them or stigmatize them, and they don't ever give them a chance to just, almost like catch your breath. Now, does that mean you don't hit them hard with punishment? Maybe so. But you still have to have somebody on the outside that kind of closes the parameter and says, now let's really talk about what's going on here. Not the crime you committed. It's the fact that you can't handle the substances that you're doing. And how do you get people to that point? Because we don't even want to talk about it. Prevention's talking about it a lot. Not really the addiction aspect, but talking about prevention. I have people ask me all the time, what do you do for a living? Try to describe prevention to somebody. It's like trying to tell them how to build a rocket. It's just, but it's really about the community. It's about destigmatizing it. It's about having that communication. It's about having a community impact that makes a significant change in the community's life. You mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, The Tipping Point, a fascinating book because that's where community change happens is when you reach that critical tipping point. That's when change happens in an individual's life, that critical tipping point. How do you get them to that tipping point? How do you get them to see that they're on the precipice every single day of your life? Because that's the reality of an addict. I've been in recovery a long time. Guess where I'm at? I'm on the tipping point. Every single day of my life, I'm on the tipping point. It's a renegotiation of the contract that I won't drink if I can have other people support me in my sobriety. That tipping point's always there. Why? Because that's the nature of addiction. The addiction never goes away. Too many people have demonstrated after prolonged periods of sobriety or abstinence that they start engaging again, and it's just as worse than it ever was. Mm-hmm. And that's the nature of addiction. It's not, it's you pick up as if where you left off, and I believe that about myself. So I'm on that tipping point, and I have to realize that it's allowing the people in my life to also play a role in that, and provide support in that indirectly, because I wouldn't survive if I was in an environment where people were constantly shaming me for the fact that I'm an addict. Mm-hmm. Or people were shaming me because of some of the things that I did in my life. If I had to be subjected to that every day, it would be very difficult for me to survive. So I'm in an environment where people say, me too, I did that. I understand. It's safe to talk about it here. The more we can replicate that, whether it's in jails, institutions, hospitals, wherever that is, the better chance we're going to have for people to go, this is the bottom, because bottom just describes when you finally went, there's another one waiting, and another one after that, and another one after that. And the ultimate bottom is when it will kill you. You can't go any further. You can't pick up after that. And so I think that it's imperative that you're doing things like this, and that you from someone that's on the outside and not living with an addiction or in recovery, you're really trying to do something to carry the conversation in a place where the broader public will get some insight into what this is really like, because it's devastating. I was doing some number crunching. I did some evaluations for the National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. And I was looking at some of those numbers and thinking about it, and I'm like, the number of people in my neighborhood that have no idea the significant impact that drugs have on children it's painful to even try to understand that, because everybody thinks it happens to someone else. Yet I have neighbors that their drug use is impacting their children. Nobody understands that. That's that correlation. So how do we have that conversation? How do we elevate it so that people go, yeah, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. And the more we can do that, and the more we can say, and you already mentioned it, the more we can say, I can't do this anymore, and there are people that can help you, and recovery is possible. The number of people that have told me that, and that I've told that, and you see the look in their eyes when they're like, really? I can actually get better? I argued for 3 straight days that I was never going to not be an addict, and I was going to die that way with this treatment counselor. I just knew. I'm in, this happened, there's no way out. I didn't believe in the idea that you could make a change in your life. I didn't think it was possible, or I didn't want to think it was possible. But he didn't back down. And for 3 days, we had this conversation, and it slowly started to sink in. I could start making a different choice day by day by day by day by day. And how many people don't understand that? They think they're stuck in this. I'm a convict. I'm a criminal. I'm an ex-con. I'm an addict. I'm a spousal abuser. I'm fill in the blank, whatever it is. That's who I am. I've been labeled. I can't get over it. Everybody can change. Everybody can change. I believe recovery is possible for everybody, and the secret ingredient is finding the right combination of programs, people, need medications, whatever that looks like, to get you stable enough so that you can recover. And I interviewed a woman on one of my podcasts, and her daughter had psychosis induced by the substances she was using and could not stay clean. And she finally got the right combination of therapy and treatment and medication and all that. And she was able to get stable. And after a period of time, the drug-induced psychosis cleared up and she was able to come off the medication. She had to be convinced that this was only going to be for a period of time. And in her case, that proved to be true. Others, it may not be, but it's like you have to find the right people that can say, try this. This might work for you. And the only way that happens is by you saying, hey, let's have a conversation, and me saying, hey, okay, I'll have a conversation. And then you share this with your network and people go, never thought about that before. Mm-hmm. Then we can start to make a change in people's lives, because I can't believe that recovery is not possible for everyone. Not everyone's going to find it. That's the sad truth. I can't tell you the number of people I know that have died, those that I used with and those that I've met since. And it's sad. It's devastating. It's heartbreaking. But I believe it's possible. And I have to hold on to that. If I can't hold on to that, Daniel, what am I doing here?
Yeah, I relate to that. I found sort of the love for this kind of conversation by doing the naloxone trainings that I was doing with my last organization. I would just have people come up to me, and sometimes they would just come up and just
share their story.
They would just dump their recovery story in my lap, and I was like, all right, I didn't ask for this, but thank you. Holy cow, that was a level of vulnerability that I was not planning on, because that's not what this presentation is about. I had other people come up and say, if I had known you were a cop before, I wouldn't have even been here today. And then they hear my perspective on it, because naloxone really boils down to a second chance. And there are some people who think, oh, well, we shouldn't be solving a problem by keeping people alive, which if you word it that way, it makes them very uncomfortable. And I had the same issue training and coaching and helping people develop policy for schools around naloxone, because some school districts or school boards would take issue with the idea of having it. It's just like that. It's that old way of thinking of, if we say we have a problem, everybody will know we have a problem. Yeah. If you look around the room, it's a room full of people who are fully aware that you've got a problem. And so by hiding it or preventing solutions from being discussed, you're perpetuating the problem, not keeping it under wraps. And so when people said, hey, my school board has been pitched this idea of having naloxone in the school to prevent overdose, how do I get them to see that it is necessary, that it's going to be for the good, and it's not going to be some reputation killer? And I said, you have to be very direct. I'm a person who believes in second chances, but there is no second chance for the dead. And that's the very blank way I put it, where it just, you cannot get a second chance once you are dead. There is no, and then I found recovery after I died. It's not the way it works. And so I would tell these nurses for these school districts across the state of Kansas, ask them to identify a specific student within their district that they would be willing to sacrifice to prove that they are right or wrong in their assumption.
Pick the one that falls through the cracks, and nobody wants to do that.
Name one.
But that illustrates the simple point.
Yes.
You don't know who that child is going to be or who that person is going to be. Pick the one. That's what Eric Nation at National Deck said. That was the turning point for him. He said, "Oh, it's a joke." They would say 100% happy, healthy individuals, and he said one day he realized, okay, who's gonna pick the 2% that's not going to be happy? Who? Nobody does, and it's about giving 100% of our attention to the issue. And I think that you've done prevention long enough. You see this in the community, and if you've done naloxone training, you understand it even closer and having these conversations. I think that the crux of this is a very painful thing for anybody to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody really wants to say it's as much my issue as it is yours.
Mm-hmm.
It's your problem. You're the one that drank. It's your problem. You're the one that OD'd. But Father Martin, he did one of my favorite videos of all time called Chalk Talk. It explains addiction in a way that it's very street level. Anybody could get the understanding of what alcoholism or addiction is by watching Chalk Talk. And he said, and this is an old statistic, I don't know what it would be today. He said, I believe, I'm hoping I'm quoting this right, someone's addiction impacts a minimum of 36 people, one person, because you have to take into consideration friends, family, children, neighbors, co-workers, church congregants, whoever's lives you touch in some way or another, you're impacting 36 different people. I don't know how they came up with the statistic, but I realized that's fascinating. It doesn't just hurt the addict. It doesn't just hurt the person that's got a mental health issue. It's hurting a lot of people. And for us to really be honest about that, and that's when you peel away that stigma, you go, I'm involved in this. Maybe not directly, but I'm involved with this ancillary, fallout of the addiction, or knowing someone that's bipolar or whatever. It hurts. And to address it means I have to address that. And I think that's a big leap for us to take in realizing that if this isn't everybody's issue, whose issue is it? It's we have to look at it differently. That's what stigma does. It protects us from seeing it. That's what denial does. It protects us from understanding it and owning it. And the addict can do that, but can you as a bystander, and can my aunt or can my friend that I go to church with, can they go, I'm watching him kill himself, but it's not my problem. Yeah, he would quit it. He knows better. He would stop. He
was raised better.
And I think, yeah. And it doesn't have anything to do with your raising. I think that, of all the things in my story, I could not have prepared myself for what that first encounter really had with me, because I had spit the alcohol out before then. When I started swallowing that stuff and the way it lit me up, it was like, I'm home. Something about that clicked inside my brain. And I wanted to give up everything. I used to think I wanted to become a professional partier. I didn't know how you got paid for it. I mean, that's sad, Daniel. That's looking for an identity, and it's in the bottom of a bottle, and that's not where it lives. But when you're 16, 17, you don't know that. So, yeah, my hat's off to you for wanting to try to peel back the layers, because I think that's kind of where it is how do we start to have those conversations? And you mentioned Malcolm Gladwell. A lot of his work really feeds into this. How come we can't have these conversations in our communities, whether it's about racism or whether it's about, addiction, or whether it's about relationships, marriages, whatever it happens to be. We have a hard time communicating with one another.
Yeah.
I have a friend that joked one day, the hardest part about working with the public is you have to work with the public. It's a communication thing. It's an interaction with people at a level that's vulnerable, like you said. Just start telling you your story. And to me, hats off to those people, because they are in a place where they're not held accountable to that isolation and that shame. Because to be able to tell your truth is really devastating for someone.
Yeah. And the misconception that along the lines of the way of thinking that most people have, and I say most because I'm still convinced it's still the majority of people, think that it's just you have to decide all on your own in isolation to heal. You look at every other element of life, And there are virtually no stories that I've ever heard where someone's like, this person became the best in their field. They overcame this,
Yeah.
overcame that.
Yeah.
It's like,
Um,
all right, who was with them on the journey? Let's just dig
yeah.
one
Yeah.
layer in.
Yeah.
Who was on that journey with them? And once you start digging into it, you go and that's the great thing about the Outliers book by Malcolm Gladwell is he outlines all the circumstances that had to be in place
Right.
for some of the
For.
richest, some
Yeah.
of the most successful, some of the most
Everything. Yeah.
influential people in history to be who they became. And it
Right.
was not, they got up one day and said, I'm going to be a billionaire software developer and I'm just going to do this all on my own. Like, no, you had to have
No.
proximity to train.
Yeah.
You had to have
Yeah.
the hours to
Yeah.
commit. You had to have the
Yeah.
willingness to go above and
Yeah.
beyond what anyone else was doing at the time.
Is that the
And
story
also,
where he talks about Bill Gates and he
yes,
had access to the
yeah,
mainframe?
at
Yeah, it's
15 years old.
fascinating. You couldn't be there. Yeah.
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 And so people look at all those and go, what a great success story. And it's like, dude, he had an entire university to thank for being down
Yeah.
the road, first
Yeah.
of all,
Yeah.
and also saying, sure, why don't you come up here in the middle of the night when your parents don't know you've snuck out to do computer programming? Why don't you do that? And we won't
Right.
lock the door
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
prevent you. Like, none of that happens in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Yet, when it comes to addiction, we expect people
Yeah.
to act independently and heal in a vacuum. And
Yeah.
it's not, it's a
Yeah.
community thing. And by that, I mean, you have to have the community around you. And so just because you don't know how to help them doesn't mean you don't have the ability to care about them. And a lot of times that's really what people are looking for to
Yeah.
build a
Yeah.
foundation towards I matter. You look at the mentality behind suicide and substance use, and there's a lot of overlap. And it's the isolation. It's the I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
I'm always going
Yeah.
to be this
Yeah.
way. It's never going to get better, and I'm
Yep.
a burden to
Yep.
people around
Yep.
me. That mentality isolates. And in the incidence of addiction, it isolates, and the substance use gets worse. And in suicide, it just builds people a foundation from which to justify their own suicide. And
Yeah.
once you look at it in that context, going, they got there through this mentality, and you have to, in more or less ways, prove the opposite to be true for them to realize the reality they're living in isn't true. And they've misunderstood or they've created this narrative or had this narrative, built around them over time. And so to expect people to heal in a vacuum, it's just like saying, hey, the hospital's up the road. Why don't you go get them tonsils out? Why don't you go fix that broken bone? Just go, you know, citizen
You're
heal.
on your own, buddy.
Yeah,
Yeah. You're on
well,
your own. Yeah.
nobody expects major things like that to be solved in the vacuum of other people support,
Yeah.
whether that's medicine, whether that's medication. They need more than what they have, and so just saying, "Hey, I don't know how to help you, but I'm here, and I want to help.
Yeah.
Let me know how I can help. Let me know when you're ready to come talk to me when you're ready to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Come if you need
Yeah.
a hot meal, come over here. You're always going to have someone who loves you and cares for you. It may not be. You can stay with me because that's one of the big things that I've seen is there's such an element of lost trust that happens just sort of inevitably with addiction because it's isolating, creates conflict between people. And so I've heard people say that if you want your kid to get clean, you have to kick them out of the house. And I'm also like, there's a whole lot of homeless people out there who somebody thought it was a great idea to kick them out of the house and they didn't have a car to live in or somebody's couch to crash on. And so I've heard people where that worked very well, where they kicked a 18-year-old kid out of the house and they were back within 48 hours because they didn't have anything to lean on
Yeah.
but the system that they left. And I've also
Yeah.
seen that people just disappeared. Like they were either never seen again.
Yeah.
They were lost to the streets, if you wanted to call it that way, in which they lost the only support system they had, and therefore they went to find one to fill the gap. Again, it's one of those situations where there's not a perfect answer to the question. There is no situation where I can tell you
Right.
this is exactly what you have to do. You
Right.
have to kick this kid out. You have to move this kid in. You have to say, yeah, keep stealing my stuff to pay for this. No, but there have to be boundaries that are healthy for everybody involved that also indicate that the people setting the boundaries still care enough
Right.
to have you in their life and to care that you will take steps to recover when the time comes. There's no easy and perfect way to do it. And so it's about understanding that person and getting to know them as much as possible so you can figure out where you fit into helping, because we don't always have a clear answer. And I think that's what most people miss. They think because I'm not trained in this, I'm not equipped for this, I shouldn't be a part of this. And so ignorance isn't bliss. Ignorance is apathy. Ignorance is indifference. Because if it doesn't bother me, or if I don't know about it, then it doesn't bother me,
Yeah.
is a really fantastic way to have an entire small town, and I've seen some towns around the state of Kansas that were vibrant 20 years ago when I was, a teenager. And then I drive through them now and you could pick up a house for a song and a dance because that town died from a number of ways, oftentimes overlapping with an extreme prevalence of substance use and addiction in the community. It's rarely the only symptom. It's, believe it or not, meth doesn't come through and burn a town down. It's a thing that accompanies other socioeconomic and community factors that usually accompanies negative downturns in a community. And so when times are good, we get to ignore it. And when times are bad, we think that's all that's going on. And it's not that simple. And
Yeah.
the more we can encourage people to just, you don't have to know where your place is, but if you care and if you can listen, if you can understand and look for an opportunity to help somebody. Like we can't all help everyone, but we can all help someone. And so if we take
Yeah.
that mentality, we take this, there's way like it's too big of a community problem for me to solve. You're right, but it doesn't mean that you can't be a small part of the solution or you can't be a support system for an individual. The number of stories I've heard where, like, once this person broke through the barriers that existed and got into recovery, they go back to their house and sometimes they go back and it's riddled with substance use in that home. And other times they go back and say, this is what's happening now and this is what I'm a part of, and you can be a part of it or not. And then there's people coming from the same home into the treatment programs or getting requests for assistance or services around substance use treatment that would not have had person one not had the experience they had. And so the ability to help one person creates a situation like where for you spent the last 35 years growing from that time and helping people. Like most of like the jobs that you've described were directly linked to helping people, to encouraging people, treating people, counseling people. Like they in some way give back to the community that they related to and were a part of at some point. And we don't know who the next Steve Miller is going to be, who 35 years later is talking about being part of TUI programs and going to school and for counseling and being a part of 12-step programs that you thought were going to be ridiculous and stupid. And you went anyways one day after circling the block 6 times. We don't know who's going to have that story.
Yeah.
But every person that we can help has the opportunity to be that. They can't be that while they're in it. The overcoming story starts much later. Like people don't realize they've overcome until they have. And even then, they will still look me in the eye and say, one day at a time. Because in reality, that's the mentality they were in during the addiction. Most people don't have a 5-day plan when they're going through active addiction.
Yeah.
A 5-year plan would be insane to ask. You,
five minutes.
You go into college after this? You doing this? You want a wife and kids someday? Like the whole conversation makes no sense because people are genuinely in a state of survival mode that we don't recognize on the outside. And that's why saying, go get clean, get help, take care of yourself, stop doing that, just quit. All those just short, simple answers that we would love to just solve the problem don't. And I love being able to interact with people who have these stories and pass them
what
along.
You're saying is kind of interesting because I heard a person share this one time, and it falls in line. It's like the general rule in society is 2 + 2 = 4. In spiritual mathematics, 2 + 1 can equal 7.
Yeah.
You can't explain it. And I think that people get hung up on when I say spiritual mathematics. They're like, what does that mean? To me, it's what you've used this word several times. If you're stuck in a world of isolation, mathematics doesn't work. It just, you can't make 2 and 2 equal 4, let alone 2 and 1 equals 7. It's because you're locked into this isolation. It's when you start to do things with others or allowing others to do things for you. And when I heard this person tell that story, they were looking at serious time. Like the crime they committed and the place that they were going didn't make them seem like they were going to see the light of day for a very long time. And they went on the same kind of thing. Well, I'll do this because they told me to do it. By the time they got back to judge and by the time they got to sentencing, the mathematics don't add up. 2 and 2 means I'm going away for a long time. 2 and 1 means I'm going to go away for a little while and my life is going to completely change, and I don't even know that. And I think that people don't really get the fact that nobody's, like you illustrated earlier, nobody made it here by themselves. You have to rely on other people to be some sort of a guidance for you, or if not even a guidance, somebody that can listen and can hear what they're going through. And we don't have a society by and large that towards that, because the spiritual mathematics was, I went back to college because I was going to get either an MBA or a master's in entrepreneurship, and somewhere along the line I got involved with a nonprofit. It wasn't a nonprofit organization at the campus, but it was a representation of that nonprofit at a college level. And when I started giving back to the community through that particular arena, I don't know why I thought this, Daniel. Sometimes I wonder about my thinking. I thought, I'm going to dedicate my life to working for nonprofits. And I was like, it's not a bad thing, but it was like, that was not, and it wasn't until I had really gotten a taste for, and what it was is it was students in free enterprise. And what it was I had never really done any kind of service work on a community level. Service work that I had done had been through my recovery and the smaller scale stuff we did with the treatment program, which was service that was being provided in that way. But this was about giving back to the community. And when I saw it on a national level and what college campuses were doing, their chapters at each one of the campuses were doing, it blew my mind. I'm like, I was older then. These are traditional college age students, and the programs and the projects they were developing to make changes in their community blew my mind. I was like, wow, I really wasted my 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22 years, because they really did some things that were making an impact. And I was like, I could see doing that. But had I not zigged when I wanted to zag, that would have never happened. But I didn't put myself in that position. I went to the first meeting because I had saw a pamphlet that said, would you like to improve your presentation skill? And I'm down for that. I thought that's when PowerPoint was coming out. That's how old I am. And I thought that's what it was going to be about. And I got there and I'm listening to their meeting and they're talking about helping inner city kids and all these different things. And I was like, what's that got to do with presentation? And so I finally asked, and they said, we do all these projects, which you'll have to help with. And then we do a capstone project and we present it in a national competition. And I was like, and so that's how I got involved in it. I went there to learn how to do a PowerPoint. I stuck around because I learned how to have an impact in my community. And those are the things, like you said, one thing, it's like I look back and I go, people say, well, this is random in your life. And I look back now, and this has just been in the recent past. I look back now and all those random things, I'm going to be an entrepreneur or get an MBA. I'm in nonprofits. Not that you can't have an MBA and work in nonprofits. I was thinking banking or investing or, I was going to make a lot of money. And then living in a certain place and then moving to it. And I don't know why I live here and all those kinds of things. And I look back and I go, it's all in a straight line. Everything, to me, that's what I call spiritual mathematics. It seems random, but the bottom line is it all adds up to who I am today. And all of that's in a straight line. All of it happened exactly the way it was supposed to. And will continue to happen that way as long as I'm doing the simple things I need to do to allow those kinds of things to happen. And if I could share that with the audience or with the community that I serve, it is always going to come down to how can we help make this place we live or whatever it is we're doing, work, recover. How can I help to make this a better place? If I'm approaching it from that perspective, I'm astounded at the way things change. When I get in there and I'm like, what can I get out of this? Or how can I use this to my advantage? Or any of those things, it starts to go awry. And I end up having this rich and rewarding life that I could have never planned.
Hmm.
You know, I if I'd had my say what I was going to be even in high school and in my early 20s, it would have been a fine career, and I would have found things in it. But because of this meandering path, it's really it's powerful. And if I, you know, I sometimes think if you could just bottle that up and give it to people that are making it so hard for themselves, just take a little sip of this instead of what you're drinking, and everything is going, it's like red pill or blue pill,
Yeah.
at the Matrix. Do you want to really see what life could offer you, or do you want to continue to pretend that what you're doing is living? And there's a sharp difference between the two.
Hmm.
And it only happens because I want to help people, or people want to help me, or you want to help people, and together we're going to try to help people. And somehow or another, the equation is, I have no idea. I don't have any idea if anything I've shared with anybody at any time in my life has been of any significance. But that's not important. The important part is that I just actually tried to do it.
Yeah.
And then I leave the results up to whatever they're going to be. Because I've spoken in a number of different circles about a lot of different topics. And I've met people right afterwards and weeks and months later, and people go, you know what you said really had an impact on my life. And I'll say, well, can you remember what it was I said? And they'll tell me, and I'll be like, that was influential, but I don't know what's going on in their life that they were like, oh, I know now, I know why. And I'm like, that's spiritual mathematics. I mean, I always say, it's like, I was talking about, I ate at Taco Bell, and they're like, oh, wow, I get it now. It's like, that was significant to you, but it takes me out of the equation because I don't know where those people go or what they're going to do. And to me, that's what recovery is about, but that's really limiting it. I think you get it. That's what life's about.
Hmm.
We're here to help one another. My grandmother, they always ask that question, if you could have lunch with somebody living or dead, who would it be? Always my grandma Mabel. That was my mom's mother. Because she had an uncanny way of reaching her grandson who didn't want to be reached. But she could tell me things and I would understand them. And she passed about 3 years into my recovery. And I'd love to have a conversation with her now because I could ask way different questions. But she used to talk about the depression a lot, and it really impacted me. And she said, again, this is zigging, zagging, and random, and now it lines up. She said, I hope you don't think that your grandma's being depressing when she talks about how hard it was. She said, that's not my point. My point is that this will happen again. We will find ourselves collectively as a nation or as a population in a depression or something similar to that. And it will be really, really hard, and people will struggle. And then it will get better when everyone realizes the only way out is when we do it together.
Hmm.
And I remember that like it was yesterday. And to me, that's like a capstone of what we've been talking about. I didn't pay any attention to that then. I heard it, but what does that mean, Grandma? What that means is the only way we get out of someplace that really hurts is by relying on other people to help us as we help ourselves. And if you look back, that's what the Depression, they got out of it by a nationwide unification that slowly by slowly things got better. And I put stock in that. Grandma Mabel never led me astray with her cherry pie, so I know she's not going to lead me astray with her wisdom.
No, that's excellent wisdom. I really, really like that. I talking about this conversation. There's a quote: "We oftentimes overestimate what we can accomplish in a year, and underestimate what we can accomplish in a day." And I think the same is true of society. Like you look at some like the protests and things like that are going on, or that have gone over. Say, pick a protest over the last 15 or 20 years. Most of them are very, very large problems, or like wide societal or even international is what we're seeing now. It's international conflicts that people are protesting one side or the other. And I think it's easy to get caught up in those because there's a lot of momentum. But I think we overestimate what we can do on a societal or a nationwide or worldwide scale. We underestimate how much we can do on a community level.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the reality is if we were focused on
The community is going to
improving
change
the
the
health of
world.
the
Yeah.
communities that we live in, that community would spawn greater, people start to see a place thrive and they want to find out how they can
Yeah.
replicate it. And we've kind of lost that in society too. We started looking at things where like people are thriving and we label it privilege. And sometimes it is, but in Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell talks about all the privileges these people had. Most of us were never going to have those privileges. And so they are genuinely privileged.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he never takes it and goes, privilege is a bad thing. We should bastardize the people who have it. He looked at it and said, how can we identify it? And then how can we replicate it? He talks about a private school and what they were doing differently from the public school because they were serving the same lower socioeconomic group for the private school because it wasn't one of those you got to have you know big income to send your kid here.
Right.
It was designed to serve the community that the public schools weren't able to serve as well. And they just changed a few things: how long they were in school, how long they spent in individual classes,
Yeah.
how they broke down an individual course, and how they taught subjects. And they saw massive positive results within their population or within their students. So many people will look at that and go, well, that's not fair that they have that advantage. It's like, no, you're right. How can we replicate it and all have that advantage? We don't take that step to go, that is a replicable thing that they did because they didn't invent it. They saw what people were doing here and there, and they combined it to make it something that is unique to them, but is not uniquely impossible for the rest of us. And we've sort of lost track of that. And I think if we focus on that in the element of recovery and prevention and say, okay, what are they doing well? What can we replicate here that's working elsewhere? And that's what there's so many programs out there in prevention that are evidence based, and they're evidence based because somebody took the time to go through them, to design them, to test them again, and to gather years and years of results on them so that other people can see the success and replicate it. And we
Right.
largely ignore that because we're either fully unaware that those programs exist or because the other programs that we had, like Dare, usually gets a bad name. And it was a good brand and not a technically successful program based on the data that was uh, collected around it. But there are programs that exist. And so finding those and identifying ways to replicate them where it's applicable is, I think, a very, very huge step to take in the prevention and recovery world.
I think when you talk about different programs like that, and it's oversimplifying it, but I look at it like this: there is so much money dumped into research and these evidence-based programs, and even like mental health first aid, even the SAPS training that a prevention list goes through. If you really boil it all down, the common denominator in all of those things is it's it's artificial in a way, but it's trying to guide us. It's trying to build community.
Mm.
All of those are. Every single one of those is trying to steer us back to the idea. Evidence-based doesn't work unless you replicate it the way that it's been proven
Mm-hmm.
to be effective. And it's effective because you do it this way. And the way you do it is through community. You do it in unison. It's not one person that does it. Everyone has to do it together. If everyone does it together exactly the way they say to do it, you're going to see these changes. Artificially, that creates a community. The community gets better and it gets healthier. Same thing with mental health first aid. If I'm teaching it to other people or if I'm learning from it and I'm helping someone with it, it helps to create community. What outlines the strategic prevention framework? And it's all about building community. What's going on in your community? How do you bring the community together to resolve those differences? And then the same thing is true. That's what a fellowship of people that are in recovery are there for, is to create a semblance of community. That's just a very small piece of community. And there's a joke that's often said, you go to a 12-step meeting for like an hour, and it's like, I dress up pretty good for the meeting. It's the other 23 hours that I struggle with. The idea is to learn how to have community with like-minded individuals and then be able over time with humility to be able to replicate community in your community. How do you become the person that you're portraying to be in one scenario, in another scenario? That's how we build community, a little bit at a time. And I think we could save a lot of taxpayer dollars if we just start to decide to get along with one another, because we're trying to tell ourselves we need to have community.
Yeah.
We need to help one another. We need to rely on one another. We need to be supportive of one another. And that doesn't have anything to do with political ideology or anything like that. It has to do with the fact of being a decent individual that's trying to make a difference in the world in which they live. And that, in and of itself, sounds like I'm oversimplifying it, but it really is about community. I can't see it any other way. I can teach any of those programs, and at the end of the day, it's not any good unless I go home and start doing it. And when I leave a training, I'll say, so who are 3 people you can tell your experience about today? Because if I tell 3 people, that starts to reinforce what I just learned. Those 3 people now learn something that they didn't know. Then if they tell 3 people, it's a butterfly effect. It flaps its wings in the Amazon and there's a typhoon in Japan. It's like it starts to grow, but that's about building community. And I'm excited about that kind of stuff because it seems simplistic. It seems like it's more complicated than that. I think the only thing that complicates it is this 3 pounds of gray matter between my ears. Everything else is just action and being tolerant and understanding of people that are different from me. And I illustrated that, or tried to. If it weren't for Clarence, and I would have not been tolerant or tried to understand that man 60 seconds before he introduced himself, but he changed my life. And not that he's responsible for that, because I had to be willing to hear things that I didn't want to listen to. And then I was able to change. Then I was able to make the things happen in my life that I was not able to do alone. And it took somebody else that was willing to hang in there with a person like me. And that's community, whether you like it or not. I built a bond in a community with his family and their community that I would have never had. Never in my life would have I had that experience if it hadn't have been when one person turned to me and said, "Hey, I think you and I got a lot in common." Really? Let's reevaluate that real quick. Found out we have a whole lot in common. And it's interesting, when he introduced himself, he said, we have a lot in common. And he told me, I said, years later, I said, why did you tell me that, Clarence? And he said, well, to be honest with you, he said that Clarence had a lot of kids. I don't remember how many, I think 9. And one of his daughters died from addiction. And he said, when you were sharing your story, something about it just reminded me of my daughter. And he said, I didn't want to see what happened to her happen to you. Mm. And I was like, oh, I get it. And then it was even years later, I was actually doing a presentation and I started to talk about Clarence, and it dawned on me exactly what you say. You're completely in denial about the fact that you're dying, Steve. And even though you don't know me and I don't know you, I'm willing to help you help yourself until you can understand that you're dealing with a life-threatening illness. Addiction always gets worse. And I was like, wow, it was just like if he'd have tried to approach me with, "You're going to die from this," and I would have been like, yeah, get away from it. He just lived it by example, and it took me a while to figure out that he was willing to sacrifice the pain and the humiliation that I subjected him to because of my arrogance, until I was able to say, "Hey, we're friends." And that didn't happen overnight, Daniel. And I'm embarrassed and humiliated every time I talk about it, because that's no way for people to conduct them, not in the mature society that I think we live in. And he changed my life and gave me the space where I could see who I was. That won't happen. That would not happen. It didn't happen for me in a moment. It might have for some people. It took a lot of me saying some really inappropriate things and him just saying, well, let's talk about something else right now.
Recovery is an environment of second chances.
I've been given 1 and a 3rd and a 4th and a 5th and a 6th.
Yeah. I'm a man of faith, and I can't be who I am. I can't be the husband and the father that I am without grace and without second chances, because I need a never-ending supply of them, because I am wildly imperfect. And we miss that about ourselves, and we expect more of others than ourselves. And I think if we take that and go, if I need as much grace as I need, can I extend as much grace as is needed for others? And with that mentality, we can bridge a whole lot of community divides and solve a lot of problems by simply going, is this just an area where I need to show a little grace and
Yeah. Yeah.
offer somebody a second chance to, you know, make a change in their life? Because yeah, without clarence, like,
Is it?
can you picture like what life would be like had that individual not intersected with your life? And you talk about being a
Yeah.
straight line. Like, do you think like in some ways that's where you're
Someone else might have come along, but I don't know. And would I have stayed around as long as I did? Would I have found somebody else? It's hard to tell. But if things played their own course, chances are I'd have got really tired of the isolation, and I'd have stopped engaging in the fellowship, because I didn't have somebody that was holding me accountable, or that was, was there every time I showed up, so to speak. You know what I mean? And it's like when you said that, it made me think the hardest thing that I realize is that it's the little things along the way that I don't see that make the biggest difference, because I'm looking for the big ideas, you know? And it's like it's the little subtle things that really change our lives in a very profound way. And I think that that's what really is it about. And I was thinking that people ask me a lot of times, since I've, been in recovery a long time, like, well, what's the difference between, then and now, or whatever? What's so significant about it? And that's like, there really isn't anything significant about it, except that it's really significant. And what I mean by that is if you're an addict and you understand what that is like, I've been able to live my life successfully without ever having to rely on drugs or alcohol as a coping mechanism ever again. To a lot of people, that doesn't mean anything. To me, that's hugely significant, because I've lost people, I've had health issues, I've had financial setbacks, all these things that other people have, and not everybody drinks over them.
Mm.
But for some reason or another, I've found it not necessary to do that during even the high times. Everything's going great, let's celebrate. I've been able to abstain all this time, and it's significantly insignificant, if that makes sense. But that only happens if you live a sober life. The only way you figure it out is you're not going to get riches and wealth and fame unless that's what you're after, or you're not going to make a name for yourself or write the bestseller unless that's what you're after. But what you're going to get is the ability to not ever have to do what almost killed you.
Mm.
That's pretty significant. It's like, seems pretty simple, but I renegotiate it every morning when I wake up. How about another 24? Because I don't know what's coming down the pike and what might derail me. Because things can be significant in life, but if I have the tools and the people and the resources in my life, I'm less likely to be tempted if I stay the course. You said that. It's faith. It's going to be all right. I have a good friend that says everything's going to be all right. And even if it's not all right, everything's going to be okay. And it's like, that is so simple. And it's like, just keep towing the line. And here we are having this meandering conversation. And I know how it is to edit a podcast. I'll be excited to hear how you make this sound like it's in a straight line, Daniel.
I was going to just completely disagree and say this has felt like a straight line, and your timeline was fantastic. The last thing I do two things at the end of the podcast. First thing, and we'll do them one at a time. First thing is, if there's somebody out there listening that is going through active addiction or is in the early stages of recovery, speak to that person. And what would you say to them if you were sitting right across the kitchen table from them, sharing a cup of coffee?
Well, I've already kind of illustrated that. The first thing is change is possible. It may seem like you can't imagine not having this in your life. Change is possible. Recovery is possible, but you can't do it by yourself. And the hardest part is to level the pride and let people know that you're hurting. I need your help, because the beauty of it is, in me saying I need your help, it helps that other person. And in someone saying I need your help, it helps me. Nobody's got a golden ticket here. This isn't Willy Wonka. It's like recovery is possible, and anybody can recover. You just have to let somebody in so that they can help you see that that's a reality. It's one day at a time. I mean, I remember thinking, they suggested to me in the treatment center, I was like, you mean I have to give up everything? They're like, if you want to be successful, you do. And I could not fathom a life. I mean, I was already planning to get high at my 50th high school reunion. I was 25 at the time. That's how my brain worked. And it's like I couldn't imagine that. And now I can't imagine doing that stuff. Did that happen on day one? No, it happened as a result of believing that I could change, recovery was possible, and telling another person, I'm really hurting here and I don't know what to do. Can you help me? Even though I knew they were going to say, no, you're broken, you're unsalvageable, you're weird, you're strange, get away from me. They said, yeah, me too. And then we helped one another. And that's the beautiful thing about recovery is it's one person helping another to achieve long-term recovery one day at a time. And I'm willing to do that with anybody that's willing to say, uncle.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. The last is I offer an opportunity. If you've got a project, you got your own podcast that you do, anything that you wanted to pitch or say, hey, this is where people can find me, learn more about the work you're doing, stuff like that. Take your time.
Yeah, I do a podcast for I work for the Mid America PTTC, and currently I do a podcast called Prevention Perk, and it's all about people that are in the industry of substance misuse prevention, mental health promotion, mental health awareness, a lot of different topics we talk about. Sometimes leadership development, but it's all within the purview of the prevention industry, if you will. And so, if people are interested in learning more about that. That's the first and third Thursdays of the month. There's over 100 episodes that I've already dropped. It was started by your good friend and my good friend Dave Clausen, and I picked it up after he dropped it off, and so that's out there. And then it's way back old school. Not that I'm particularly impressed by it or anything, but I did a series for an organization that I used to work for, and it's called HELP. That's the acronym, but it's Helping Everyone Learn Prevention. You could Google that, and there's a whole YouTube page through Community Partnership of the Ozarks. But I and a woman named Ricky Martin put together a series of 30-some videos. They're all like 5 to 10 minutes long. And that, to me, I just share them with you because if people are interested in learning more about prevention, that would be a great place that they could learn little snippets because I realize we have short attention spans in our society. And then I'll share the link with you later, but I'm kind of proud of it. I hope it turns out as well as my imagination thought it did, but I did that TED style talk for NatCon. And if I get the link in time, I'll share that with you and you can provide that to the listeners. Just, it was a lot of fun. I would have never thought I'd get invited. I've seen TED Talks and you probably have too.
Yeah.
To be invited to do that was an honor and a privilege. And I walked into the audience knowing what had happened last year when I saw it. There were 250 people in the room. So I'm thinking there'll be 250, 300 people in the room when I get there. There were 1,400 people in the audience. And I was like, wow. So I'm pretty excited about it. Again, people have asked me what was it like. I don't know. I heard people laugh. I heard people kind of empathize with me, but it went by in a blur because it's 18 minutes and but yeah, I'll share it with you if it's available and you can share that with people.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make sure we get that in the show notes if it's out and available in time. And Steve, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with everybody. And hopefully we can circle back and maybe have further discussions on prevention and recovery. And you're welcome here anytime.
Thanks.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Steve. Thanks for tuning in to the American Recovery Podcast. Check out the show notes for links to resources and organizations discussed in this episode. The link for Steve's TED-style talk entitled Does Music Move Our Choices is in the notes. See you next time.